As Julia said, even though some or a few people might still be missing, we have a critical mass, so we'll start. So yesterday, in the first part of this introductory lecture, we talked about definitions, different types of differentiated integration. We also distinguished differentiated integration from other forms of flexibility that the EU has to accommodate heterogeneity among its member states. We discussed three different modes of differentiated integration that have been theorized in the literature or even also proposed in policy proposals. Then we've moved on to the question, why differentiated integration? Talking about demand, which is basically increasing heterogeneity under continuing unanimity, which drives this demand. We've also looked at some supply-side conditions, size, externalities. There are, of course, more, but these are, let's say, the two more functional prerequisites. And then at the end of yesterday's lecture, I introduced the two main logics of differentiated integration, the instrumental and the constitutional logic. So this is where we stand. Okay, so what we'll do today is apply the concepts we've talked about yesterday and the theoretical logics to the development and patterns of differentiated integration. And we will do that based on data. Yeah? So much of the work that we've done over the past 10 years or so has been actually collecting data on differentiated integration in order to see what's actually going on and in order to test these expectations. There are, if you are interested, there are two data sets. One on treaty-based differentiations, where the unit of analysis is the treaty article. So we code whether any treaty article is differentiated and which countries are excluded or exempted. And then we have a data set, EU Diff2, which is on secondary law, legislative differentiations, where the unit of analysis is the legal act. So if a legal act is differentiated, we code it in this way. These two data sets are publicly available if you're interested. In the ETH research repository, you can download the data sets from there. I mean, if you're really into it and want to play around with the data a little bit. We've recently updated the two data sets to 2020. And for this lecture today, I even went a bit further and updated at least the treaty-based data set to 2023, based on the assumption that nothing unforeseen will happen until then, in order to also show what the latest developments are in this area. Okay, so let's start with a very simple count, which is basically the number of differentiated treaty articles in EU treaties by year. So what do you see there? Beyond a strange line.
You can see where the Big Bang enlargement happened.
Yeah. So, I mean, the single most important event for differentiated integration in the European Union was Eastern enlargement, the Big Bang enlargement. 10 new member states in 2004, and then two in addition, yeah, which in 2007, which still drove differentiated integration further. So this is not the only instance in which enlargement was a driver of differentiated integration. You see it here too, 1973, the first enlargement, a little bit less, but still visible, 1986, yeah, Spain, Portugal. Again, 1995, the EFTA enlargement, yeah. As we said, 2004, 2007, another peak there in 2013. I mean, if it's just one member state that joins, yeah, of course it's less visible than if 10 member states join, yeah. So it's also the number of member states that make a difference, yeah. But what we can also see, however, is that these enlargement peaks, yeah, are just temporary, yeah. So after each of these enlargements, yeah, we see a rise, yeah, but then also a few years after, numbers are going down again, yeah. That was true in 1973. That was true in 1986. In 2004, okay, 2007 came the other, but then we also see numbers going down again, yeah. So enlargements are main drivers of differentiation, yeah, but as according to this instrumental logic of differentiation in enlargements, it's temporary, yeah, and a few years after, differentiation goes down again, yeah. So it's clearly not a linear rise and levels stay high, yeah, but it's a bit of an up and down, yeah. It's a fluctuation in differentiations. Okay, but as Kristen already mentioned, this is a misleading look at differentiated integration. So I mean, if you want to impress people by saying, well, differentiated integration is going up and the European Union will become ever looser over time, yeah, and so if you, depending on how you see it, if you want to impress or scare people, this is what you show. But let's say the more realistic analysis is this graph, yeah, because as you rightly pointed out, differentiation also depends on the number of opportunities that you have. And of course, the more treaty articles there are, and the more member states you have, the more opportunities for differentiated integration you have, because basically every new treaty article and every new member state creates an additional opportunity for differentiation. Yeah? So for a realistic analysis, we need to look at these differentiations by opportunities. Yeah? So what this graph shows is first that, let's say, if you look at the treaty article production of the European Union overall, differentiation is actually not a big thing, yeah? Quantitatively. Yeah? So that means that over time, maybe an average of 6–7% of treaty articles are differentiated, yeah? Or let's say 6 or 7% of opportunities are being used, yeah? So it's definitely a minor portion of the entire legal production that is being differentiated. Also, what you see is if you compare the early period and the current level of differentiations, yeah, it's basically the same, yeah. So when the treaties of Rome were ratified, yeah, controlled by the number of differentiation opportunity, yeah, the communities were as differentiated as they are now. Yeah. It's just that this is here, yeah, but since there were only 6 member states and say a narrow range of policies, yeah, there weren't as many opportunities to differentiate, and that explains the low absolute number. But relatively speaking, yeah, the European Union started already as a pretty differentiated union. I mean, these were temporary differentiations. Here you also see that in relative terms, the northern enlargement had a much larger impact than the eastern enlargement if you control for the opportunities. Yeah? So again, the other picture is a bit misleading because it seems to suggest, yeah, that eastern enlargement was such a large boost, yeah, to differentiation and made the European Union so much more fragmented. Yeah? Actually, the first enlargement with the UK, Denmark, and Ireland had a relatively speaking slightly larger impact. Yeah? But then you also see it went down rather quickly. Then actually, the least differentiated period was then again until Eastern enlargement, yeah? 1970s, 80s, 90s, and now we're, say, hovering around the long-term average. Yeah, so we see a rather similar picture when it comes to differentiation in EU legislation. Yeah, so here we've looked at regulations and directives over time. Yeah, and so this is until 2018. This is harder to update because it's much more work to look at the legislation than at the treaties. And here we also see, I mean, this also seems to match the idea, yeah, of an ever-increasing differentiation in the EU's legislation, and here we also see an especially steep rise since the late 2000s. But again, if we use the more relative measure, this looks much less dramatic. Yeah? And actually, again, what we see is that controlling for differentiation opportunities, the early years of European integration were much more differentiated. Yeah? And that when it comes to legislation, we've actually seen a long-term decline of differentiation, yeah, from the 1960s all the way to the to around 2010. So actually, when it comes to the legislation of the European Union, it has become less differentiated over time. It's a steady decline. Again, we have peaks here, yeah, with the enlargements. This interesting peak is German reunification, yeah, which also created some legislative differentiation for a couple of years. But overall, it's going down. Recently, going up again a little bit, but still, let's say, at the same level as, let's say, the 1980s, 1990s. So nothing dramatic in the long-term view. Yeah. So here, even more than with regard to treaty differentiation, we actually see that at the level of legislation, the European Union over time has actually become more uniform, yeah, rather than differentiated. Again, that was a surprising finding for us when we started out. I mean, of course, you have a rough idea of differentiations in the EU treaties. no one had really looked systematically at differentiations in the EU legislation. And again, our assumption was at the time, well, treaty differentiation is just the tip of the iceberg, yeah? And we will find a lot more when we look into the actual legislation. Yeah? And so at first this seemed to be vindicated, but then when we controlled for the number of laws and the number of member states, again, I mean, this was an expectation that was defeated by the data. Yeah? And that's of course the fun of empirical research, yeah? that you have data, and you can check on your assumptions then empirically. So again, yeah, very similar picture here. Okay, so this is the overall picture. Now I want to go into the specific modes of differentiation and see, okay, what's the evidence for how much the differentiation in the EU is multi-speed, multi-tier, and so on. So, our first finding was that differentiated integration is predominantly multi-speed. Yeah? What we find is, so we, I won't go into the details here, but we say we aggregate, this is again treaty-based, yeah? So we aggregated treaty articles to policies, yeah? Because otherwise you get a very skewed picture. Yeah? So I say, because of how the EU treaties are constructed, an opt-out from Schengen is 160 articles. An opt-out from the free movement of labor is one article. Yeah? And so if you just count the articles, you get a very biased picture. So we aggregated them to policies. Yeah? And then this gives us the number of 233 differentiations that we've had in the treaty articles since 1952, of which by the end of this year, 161 will have expired. Yeah? So close to 70% of the differentiations that had been negotiated are basically gone. Yeah? So that means, okay, this is predominantly multi-speed. Yeah? And if you look at the mean duration of these differentiations, it's according to these newest numbers, which are a bit higher than the older ones, it's 8 years, 10 months. Yeah, so it's still a reasonable period of time. Yeah. And then, if you remember, according to the two logics, what we should see is that the instrumental logic based on accession treaties, yeah, we would expect that to be more multi-speed than the constitutional differentiation based on treaty revisions. And indeed, what we see is that differentiations from accession treaties are shorter, yeah, 7.2 years on average. Those from treaty revisions are longer, more durable, 10.8 years. So that's a significant difference. But what is, I think, even more telling is if you look at the differentiations from accession, of those 88% are already terminated. Yeah? So this is clearly multi-speed, whereas those agreed on in treaty revisions, yeah, it's just over half that have been terminated. So here we have these durable differentiation, and all differentiations that have been in place for longer than 20 years come from treaty revisions. Yeah? So also there is a clear difference. So I mean, it shows that differentiation based on accession is something very different from differentiation based on treaty revisions, yeah? In terms of the durability and in terms of the chances and in terms of the permanence of differentiation. yeah, I also wanted to show, sorry, here, yeah. So this shows the development of differentiations after new member states join the European Union. And what you see is that this black line, during the first years of membership, this number of differentiation goes down rather quickly. Yeah, so after 8 years, yeah, so this 7-8 years, which is the average duration, yeah, then say new member states are basically on a stable path that's quite similar to the old member states. And but there are some significant differences between cohorts of new member states. Yeah, so which also show that, let's say, poorer new member states have more differentiations. Yeah, they suffer from more initial exclusions from participation in EU policies. So if you take the 1995 cohort, rich northern member states, they have started at a lower level than the average, yeah, and also moved down rather quickly. Yeah, whereas the 2007 to 2013 cohort has started at a much higher level of differentiations and has also remained at a rather high level so far. Okay, so we clearly see this multi-speed logic, yeah, in these accession-based differentiations. But as I pointed out, there's regional variation that we can also see in secondary law. Yeah. Or the development of differentiations in secondary law over time. Again, what we so these are the original member states. Yeah, so there's a lot going on. Now, if you if you see the first enlargement cohort, yeah, rather high level of differentiation in secondary law at the beginning, going down, but then in the since the 2000s, it's going up again. We also see that this is of course mainly driven by Denmark, the UK, Ireland. Denmark and the UK not being in the Eurozone, and all of these countries not having opt-outs from justice and home affairs. Yeah. So what this also shows, and this comes back to what we've discussed before, is that we see some kind of a trickle-down process from primary law differentiation into secondary law differentiation, because of course the legislation of the European Union follows the treaties, and if you have a differentiation in the treaties, yeah, that will also show in the secondary legislation. And since in this period, the EU has been quite productive in making laws in differentiated areas, you can also see that for those countries who have treaty-based differentiation, that this will show. And this also means that this uptick, yeah, this is mainly driven by legislation in these differentiated areas, and it's mainly driven by just these 3 countries. Yeah, because for all of the other countries, there's no uptick here. Yeah, it remains rather stable, or it's even going down. Yeah, so. The recent rise in secondary law differentiation was mainly due to Denmark, Ireland, and the UK, and so here we also should see actually quite a visible impact of Brexit. Yeah, we haven't checked that yet because we haven't coded the data for the recent years, but this should be visible. Yeah, if it's just driven by 3 countries, if one drops out, this should be visible. And again, we see that the more recent new member states, yeah, again, have not been major drivers of differentiated integration in EU secondary law. Yeah, so this, what you sometimes hear, yeah, that when you take in new member states, that means that the EU will become looser, yeah, or that legislation, yeah, will be harder to achieve or more differentiated. That is just not correct. Yeah. Recent differentiation after the Eastern enlargement has not been driven by these new member states, yeah, rather stable, but by some of the older member states. Okay? So, so that actually shows how much differentiated integration is multi-speed. Yeah, it's predominantly multi-speed. Yeah, you could say, okay, maybe 2/3 of it is multi-speed to have a rough number. And multi-speed differentiation is mainly driven by the enlargements of the European Union, but the effects of the enlargements are temporary. Yeah? Enlargements are not what, let's say, drives a durable fragmentation of the European Union. Yeah? So that's something that you can take home and tell people who are, say, wary of enlargements of the European Union as something that drives the EU apart. This is definitely not true. Which means that for the rest of the differentiations, we can check whether that is multi-tier, yeah? Or is it maybe multi-menu? So here, what does this graph show? So here we have on the x-axis the number of ongoing differentiations pre-Brexit, yeah? 2018. And here we have the number of differentiations that countries have had in their history of membership. Yeah? So, and you can do that in 2018, you can do that in 2015, 2010, 2005. The picture is really always rather similar. Yeah? That it seems to show that we have 3 tiers of members. Yeah? We have one group here between 0 and 2 differentiations active. We have these outliers here, UK and Denmark, with a high number of differentiations, not only overall, but also a high number of active differentiations. Yeah? So these they form a tier, and then we have, let's say, a middle group of country, call them the semi-periphery, yeah? With between 4 and 9 here, but these numbers change, of course. So I mean, this is a structure that we can observe basically since the 1990s, yeah, where it has emerged as a result of the Maastricht Treaty and the Schengen agreements. Yeah, this is what we see. Now, what I think is interesting to note here is, I mean, usually when we speak about core periphery relationships, we have the idea of something like a pyramid. Yeah, so we have a small core, yeah, and then a large number of peripheral actors. Yeah? So this is, of course, the other way around in the European Union. Yeah? The core is the largest group of member states. And if you remember what we said about size yesterday, yeah? I mean, this seems to show, yeah, that differentiated integration usually works in the way that there's a large group of member states that want to go ahead with integration, but there are a few member states that are either not willing or not able to follow. Yeah? And this makes the core of fully or almost fully integrated member states by far the largest group in the European Union. Yeah? So this is not your exclusive core, yeah, which dominates a broad number of peripheral member states. This is rather an inclusive core, yeah, where some mavericks are allowed to stay out. Yeah. So this is one important lesson. The second lesson is that there's actually quite high mobility. Yeah? So we have many examples of states that had a lot of differentiations when they joined, and that are now part of the core. Yeah? The best examples are, for instance, Lithuania and Latvia here, yeah, which had, when they in their history of membership, had 11 differentiations, so quite a large number. Now they are down to 1. Yeah? Greece, Estonia, Slovakia are also examples, yeah, of countries starting out with a high starting out basically at the periphery, but then within a few years, yeah, moved all the way from the periphery to the core. So it's a highly permeable system that allows for a lot of mobility. Yeah. Again, I think that's important also for the legitimacy of differentiated integration, because it sends the message: if you want to, and if you put efforts into it, yeah, then even if you're initially discriminated and excluded, yeah, within a few years you can actually be part of the core, and that also applies to poorer member states. Yeah, it's not that when you enter as a relatively poor member state that this means that you will remain on the sidelines forever, yeah, because first the southern member states and now many of the eastern member states have actually been able to join the core. And if you don't join the core, this is typically not because you are excluded or you're prevented, yeah, from becoming part of the core, but it's basically on your own decision. Yeah, so it also shows how much this is a voluntary system. Of course, based on their capacity, the UK and Denmark could have been part of the core if they had ever wanted to. And also here, for this medium group, we can see that, for instance, for the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, it's their own decision, yeah, not to do everything they can to join the Eurozone, which keeps them in this group. Yeah. Because the main distinction between this group and this group, Ireland is a bit in between, is these are the Eurozone members and these are the non-Euro area member states. Yeah. So again, as I said, the Euro area now is the most important policy area that for differentiated integration, especially for durable differentiated integration. It accounts for the main divide, and because of the Euro area crisis, which triggered a number of reforms that were again differentiated, this divide has also widened between the Euro area and the non-Euro area countries. The third observation is then that this multi-tier structure, yeah, is mostly driven by core state power policies. Yeah. This has nothing to do with the internal market, yeah. But the main policies that create this structure are, as I said, monetary integration, but then also justice and home affairs and Schengen. So again, interior policies that are usually seen as part of core state power policies. So here you have you have countries that are in the Eurozone and are members of Schengen. These are not in the Eurozone, but members of Schengen. And not just members of Schengen, but part of the Justice and Home Affairs integration. And these are countries that are both outside the Euro area and also have, at best had voluntary opt-ins into the Justice and Home Affairs policy. So it's clearly these policies that structure the system. Just wanted to show you how this looks post-Brexit. Yeah. So of course one of the peripheral countries is now gone. Yeah. That means indeed that maybe this three-tier structure will disappear over time. I think it's an ongoing process. We've already seen Denmark moving closer, yeah, because it has given up its foreign policy opt-out. There is some speculation, yeah, that maybe in due course Denmark and Sweden, for instance, might join the banking union. Yeah, there are there's some discussion. So remains to be seen. We have a very nice example, yeah, just by comparing 2018 to 2023 of how the system allows for mobility. Yeah, so if you look at Croatia, yeah, it's been out here in 2018. Once it will become a member of the Eurozone in 2023, yeah, if nothing goes wrong, it's going to be in the core. Yeah, so here again we see how if countries want to and if they put their efforts into it, they have a chance within a few years to actually move from the periphery to the core. And so, I mean, the picture in 2023 looks, let's say, already much less diverse or much less clearly structured in terms of three tiers than it was in 2018. So there's interesting developments, and actually, if you look at some of the recent developments in the European Union, there's quite some evidence, yeah, that our policy making has become more uniform overall, and that remains to be seen. Yeah? But now, basically, Denmark is quite alone out there. It's moving closer, maybe moving even closer in the future. That's hard to see. If at some point, for instance, Sweden would join the banking union, yeah, it would become would move much closer to the core. Also, at some point, it might happen that Bulgaria and Romania become part of Schengen, yeah, which is an ongoing issue, and that would also move them closer. So I think there's it's quite open, yeah, whether this three-tier system will really remain, yeah, or whether there might actually be a development towards more uniformity in the overall system. That remains to be seen. Yeah. So it's also interesting to observe, yeah, that for that the two countries, yeah, which have had the most differentiation in the history, the UK and Denmark, yeah, have been moving in very different directions. Yeah. So that in the case of the UK, the differentiation that there has not been enough, yeah, basically to keep the country in the EU. Whereas in the Danish case, we also have a lot of, let's say, evidence from public opinion showing that in the Danish case, differentiated integration has been a major source of support for EU membership. Yeah? So whereas in spite of all its differentiation, the UK has never been entirely happy in the European Union. For Denmark, differentiation has been a source of increasing support for EU membership in the country, and also, as we've seen recently, some flexibility when it comes to maybe giving up opt-outs, which might also reflect the fact that in the UK, differentiation has been predominantly elite-driven. Yeah? So it's been mainly driven by the Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party who have pushed the issue over and over again, even though it was not such a big issue for the population at large. Whereas in Denmark, it's the other way around. Yeah, the elite is very EU-friendly, would like to have more integration across the mainstream parties. Yeah, whereas there's some popular resistance against too much integration, and I think these are main reasons also for the two different trajectories that these countries have taken. Moving on. Now, of course, the question remains: yeah, is it multi-menu? Is it multi-tier integration? So we definitely see these tiers. I would say it doesn't really fit the idea of multi-menu integration because we have that stable core of countries which are fully integrated in all of the policies. Yeah? We do not see a core for one policy, another core for a different policy, but we have one core covering all of the policies of the European Union. So that contradicts the idea of multi-menu integration, which does not, as I said, say that there's no policy variation. There is policy variation, but this policy variation maps onto the spatial variation, yeah, the tiers. Yeah? So the tiers are clearly visible in different policies. And this is what I want to show here. So one issue to see is that when it comes to institutions, there's no legal differentiation. Yeah? So despite differentiated integration, the EU has a uniform institutional core. Yeah? And that's also something important, which also goes against the idea of multi-menu differentiation, where we would think, okay, there are basically different unions, yeah, with overlapping memberships, but with all of them having their own institutions, more or less, if you think it through to the extreme. This is not happening. So zero differentiations when it comes to institutions, and we see it's really driven by a few policies. Yeah? And here we again also see the two different logics. Yeah? So if you remember, the expectation was for instrumental differentiation. This will mainly show up in the market policies, so freedoms, expenditure policies, flanking policies of the internal market, whereas constitutional differentiation will mainly show up in the domain of core state powers, and the main distinction between the two modes of differentiation will be in the modes of differentiation, where we should expect accession-driven differentiation in the markets being temporary, yeah, whereas differentiation driven by treaty revisions in the domain of core state powers will be much more permanent. And this is also what we can see here. Yeah? So when it comes to the number of differentiations, clearly these are the two areas that have these differentiations. With regard to the market freedoms, it's an overall number of 91. Core state powers, and this is mainly interior policies and monetary policy, have a combined number of 134. Interestingly, and the average duration doesn't vary so much, at least much less than we thought it would. Yeah, so 8 years for the market, 9.4 years for core state powers. But when you look at the permanence of differentiation, yeah, it's then the distinction becomes quite striking. Yeah, only 7% of the differentiations that have ever been negotiated regarding market rules are still in place. Yeah, so 93% are gone. Yeah, so that's clearly multi-speed, right? Whereas in the area of core state powers, still 42% of the differentiations that have ever been negotiated are still in place. Yeah? So that shows it's much more durable. Those end too. It doesn't mean that they are fixed forever. Yeah? But the difference, yeah, in the percentage of ongoing differentiation is quite striking, quite clear. But it, again, the point is that these policy differences, yeah, they map onto the tiers, yeah, and as we've seen before. So we do not have a market union and a core state power union, but we have one core that is fully integrated in the market and in the core state powers, and then it's the core state powers that distinguish the other tiers. Yeah? So the middle tier is usually member states that are part of the interior policies, Schengen, justice and home affairs, but not of the Eurozone. And those, the more you move out from the core, the more likely you will find countries that are not, both non-Euro area member states and states with opt-outs in justice and home affairs and Schengen. Okay, we find a very similar picture in secondary law. Yeah? So this is policy variation in differentiations in secondary law. So here you see that that distinction when it comes to the market. Yeah, it was actually the most important area of differentiation in the 1970s. Yeah, but market policy differentiation is now the least important area of differentiation in the 2000s, whereas core state powers, which had not really been integrated, yeah, in the 1970s, for that reason it's zero, but they have basically gone up to be the most important area for differentiate integration, also in secondary law. Yeah? And then we have a bit of expenditure regulation policies in between, but they don't really count for much in terms of numbers. And this is again the same picture in legislation. So we see market differentiations related to free movement. Yeah, that has been an important area, but it has gone down. All the other areas are basically rather low. Yeah. Again, these interesting peaks having to do with German unification. It's just a random event for differentiated integration, where we see also in a secondary legislation where the drivers are of differentiated integration. It's in the interior policies and it's monetary policy, of course. Yeah. So again, I mean, when we run our analyses, the best predictor for a differentiation in legislation is always whether a country has or has not a differentiation in the treaties. Yeah, so you really see a strong institutional linkage between the two areas. Okay. So to conclude, I also want to show you some of the regression analysis that we've done. Just a few pictures. So. When we spoke about the drivers of these different Logics of integration, we said there's a different logic for treaty revisions and in accession treaties. The point was that when it comes to accession, the poorer a new member state is, the more differentiated its membership will be, at least at the beginning, yeah, not overall. Whereas for treaty revisions, we said, okay, the countries that have the most opt-outs are the wealthy Eurosceptics. Yeah? And this is also something that we can see in our data. So these are graphs that are based on larger models, yeah, where we put in a lot of variables to control. So here you see the probability that when a treaty is being made, this looks at the treaty-making episodes, and it argues that the richer a country is, yeah, measured as the gross national income per capita, the more likely it is that this country will have an opt-out. Yeah? And this is what this shows. I mean, the baseline probability is never high, yeah, because it's always a rare event, yeah, differentiation. But we clearly see, yeah, that the more countries that are poorer than the average have a lower probability than countries that are richer than the average. Yeah? And the richer you become, the more likely you will also have an opt-out. We see the same picture when it comes to identity. So this measures, according to the Eurobarometer question, yeah, whether you feel more European national. You know that question probably. This looks at the share of people in a country that have an exclusively national identity. So the higher this share is, yeah, also again, we see this effect that the higher the share of nationally exclusive identity is, the higher is the probability that this country will get an opt-out. Yeah? So it's both wealth and identity that we find here. Picture is different for accession countries. Yeah? Here we see first a much stronger effect for wealth, yeah? But it goes in the other direction. Yeah? So here, when it comes to accession treaties, the richer you are as a new member state, the less likely you will have an opt-out, the less likely you will be initially excluded from some of the benefits of membership. Yeah? That's what it basically says. Yeah? And here we have a much stronger effect, both in terms of the level of probability, but also in the line here that we see, it's steeper, yeah, than the lines that we see here, whereas we basically have no identity effect at all. So it doesn't really play out in the accession treaties, whereas it plays out in the treaty revisions.